April 6, 1917. Early morning. Washington, D.C. rain drifts across the quiet streets of the American capital. Inside the halls of Congress, tension hangs heavy in the air. The United States is about to make a decision that will change world history. For nearly 3 years, Europe has been burning in a war unlike anything humanity has ever seen. Millions are already dead. Empires are collapsing. Yet until this moment, America has remained on the sidelines. But that is about to change. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the United States was a nation growing rapidly, but still cautious about foreign conflicts. The scars of earlier wars and the long tradition of avoiding European entanglements shaped American thinking. President Woodrow Wilson believed strongly that the United States should remain neutral. He told the American people that the country must stay impartial in both thought and action. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the war was turning Europe into a graveyard. Two massive alliances had formed. On one side stood Britain, France, and Russia. On the other stood Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. What began as a regional conflict after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand quickly transformed into a mechanized slaughter. Trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across France and Belgium. Soldiers lived in mud-filled ditches, surrounded by barbed wire and constant artillery fire. New technologies such as machine guns, poison gas, and heavy artillery created levels of destruction the world had never seen before. Back in the United States, many Americans believed the war was not their fight. The nation was made up of immigrants from all across Europe. Some supported the Allied nations while others sympathized with Germany or Austria-Hungary. Taking sides could tear the country apart. Wilson insisted that neutrality was the only path forward, but neutrality was becoming harder to maintain. The Atlantic Ocean had become a battleground. German submarines known as U-boats prowled the waters, targeting ships carrying supplies to Britain. Germany believed cutting off British trade would starve the island nation into surrender. In 1915, a shocking event changed American attitudes that a massive British passenger ship, called the Lusitania, was crossing the Atlantic when it was struck by a German torpedo. Within minutes, the ship began sinking into the cold ocean waters. Nearly 1,200 people died in the disaster. Among them were 128 Americans. News of the sinking spread quickly across the United States. Newspapers printed horrifying stories of passengers drowning in the dark Atlantic waters. Many Americans were outraged. Germany defended its actions. They argued that the ship had been carrying war supplies to Britain, making it a legitimate target. But for Americans, the attack felt like a violation of international norms and human life. Still, President Wilson resisted entering the war. He believed diplomacy could still prevent America from becoming involved. For the next 2 years, the United States balanced on a knife edge between peace and war. Meanwhile, the fighting in Europe continued with relentless brutality. Entire landscapes were transformed into wastelands of craters and shattered forests. Battles like Verdun and the Somme claimed hundreds of thousands of lives without producing decisive victories. By 1917, the situation had reached a breaking point. Germany made a bold and desperate decision. Its leaders announced that they would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Any ship traveling in waters around Britain could be attacked without warning. This included neutral ships from the United States. American cargo vessels soon began disappearing beneath the waves. Then another discovery pushed the United States closer to war. British intelligence intercepted a secret message sent by Germany to Mexico. The message proposed a military alliance. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico would attack the United States. In return, Germany promised to help Mexico recover lost territories including Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The message became known as the Zimmerman Telegram. When the contents were revealed to the American public, outrage spread across the country. What had once seemed like a distant European conflict was now clearly threatening American security. President Wilson realized that neutrality could no longer be maintained, and on April 2, 1917, Wilson stood before Congress and delivered a speech that would define the moment. He declared that the world must be made safe for democracy. Germany's aggressive actions had left the United States no choice. 4 days later, Congress voted to declare war on Germany. The United States had entered the First World War. Across the nation, recruitment posters appeared in cities and small towns. Young men lined up outside military offices to enlist. Factories began shifting toward wartime production. Railroads carried troops and supplies toward ports where ships waited to cross the Atlantic. For the first time in its history, the United States was preparing to send a massive army to fight on European soil. Yet America faced a major challenge. Its military was surprisingly small. Compared to the huge armies already fighting in Europe, the United States had very few trained soldiers. Building an army capable of fighting in the trenches would require enormous effort. Training camps sprang up across the country. Farmers, factory workers, and students suddenly found themselves wearing uniforms and learning how to march, shoot, and survive on the battlefield. General John J. Pershing was chosen to command the American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing believed American soldiers must fight as a unified force rather than being scattered among British and French units. He wanted American troops to play a decisive role in the war, but first they had to cross the Atlantic safely. German submarines still hunted ships in the ocean. Convoys guarded by warships began escorting troop transports across the dangerous waters. One by one, American soldiers arrived in France. For the exhausted Allied armies that had been fighting for years, the arrival of fresh American troops brought a powerful surge of hope. The balance of the war was about to change, but the real test for America was only just beginning. June 1917. The port city of Saint-Nazaire, France. Gray warships sit quietly along the docks while thousands of curious French civilians gather near the harbor. They have come to witness something many believed would never happen. Across the wide Atlantic Ocean, a convoy of ships approaches the coast of France. On board are the first soldiers of the American Expeditionary Forces. For nearly 3 years, the armies of Europe have fought a brutal war of attrition. Entire generations of young men have disappeared into muddy trenches and shattered battlefields. Now a new force is arriving from across the ocean. As American soldiers step on a French soil, the crowd erupts into cheers. Many French citizens shout a simple phrase again and again. Lafayette, we are here. The words carry deep historical meaning. More than a century earlier, French soldiers had helped the American colonies win independence from Britain. Now Americans have come to repay that debt. But celebrations quickly give way to reality. The war in Europe is not glorious. It is harsh, exhausting, and deadly. American troops begin moving toward training areas near the front lines. There they encounter a style of warfare unlike anything they have ever experienced. The Western Front is a continuous network of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Between the opposing lines lies a devastated zone known as no man's land. This barren landscape is filled with craters, broken trees, rusted barbed wire, and the remains of countless soldiers who never returned home. German and Allied armies have been locked in this deadly stalemate for years. Each side launches massive attacks only to gain a few miles of ground at terrible cost. General John J. Pershing understands that American troops must adapt quickly. He insists that they fight as an independent army rather than being absorbed into British or French units. Pershing believes that American energy and determination can help break the stalemate. Throughout late 1917 and early 1918, thousands more American soldiers pour into France. Ships carrying troops cross the Atlantic in tightly protected convoys. German submarines attempt to intercept them, but most transports arrive safely. By the spring of 1918, the American presence in Europe has grown dramatically. At the same time, the war itself is reaching a critical moment. Germany launches a massive series of offensives aimed at defeating the Allies before American forces become overwhelming. German troops surge forward across the Western Front, capturing large sections of territory and threatening Paris itself. Allied commanders scramble to hold the line. American units are rushed into battle sooner than expected. One of the first major tests comes at a place called Cantigny in May 1918. American soldiers attack German positions in a carefully planned operation. Despite heavy resistance, they capture the village and hold it against fierce counterattacks. The victory is small in terms of territory, but it sends an important message. American troops can fight. Soon another battle begins that will become legendary in military history. In June 1918, German forces advanced toward the Marne River, only about 60 miles from Paris. If they succeed in breaking through, the French capital could fall. American Marines and soldiers are ordered to stop the advance near a thick forest called Wood. The fighting that follows is some of the most intense of the entire war. German machine guns tear through the wheat fields as American Marines charge across open ground. The air fills with the thunder of artillery and the crack of rifles. Trees shatter under constant bombardment. The forest itself becomes a battlefield of chaos and destruction. For weeks, the battle rages at close range. Soldiers fight among tangled roots and shattered branches. Hand-to-hand combat becomes common as both sides struggle for control of the woods. Eventually, the Americans push the German forces out of Wood. The victory comes at a terrible cost. Thousands of American soldiers are killed or wounded. Yet the battle proves something important to the Allies and the Germans alike. The United States has become a serious fighting force. As summer turns into autumn, the number of American troops in France continues to rise. By late 1918, more than 1 million American soldiers are on the Western Front. The Allies prepare for a massive final offensive designed to end the war. In September, American forces launched the St. Mihiel Offensive. It is the first major battle led entirely by the United States Army. Pershing commands hundreds of thousands of soldiers supported by tanks and aircraft. The attack smashes into the German lines and quickly captures the St. Mihiel salient, a section of territory the Germans had held for years. Encouraged by the success, Allied commanders launch an even larger campaign. The Meuse-Argonne offensive begins in late September 1918. It will become the largest battle in American military history up to that time. More than 1 million American soldiers advance through the dense Argonne forest and across the Meuse River Valley. German defenses are deeply fortified with machine gun nests and artillery positions. Progress is slow and costly, but day after day the American army pushes forward. Stories of bravery spread through the ranks. Soldiers rescue wounded comrades under fire. Small groups capture heavily defended positions through sheer determination. Among these soldiers are individuals who will later become legends of American military history. As the offensive continues, the German army begins to weaken. Years of blockade and constant fighting have drained Germany of resources and manpower. Food shortages are spreading at home. Morale among German troops is collapsing. By November 1918, the situation for Germany is hopeless. Revolution breaks out within the German Empire. Soldiers and civilians demand an end to the war. On the morning of November 11th, 1918, the guns finally fall silent. An armistice agreement ends the fighting on the Western Front. More than 100,000 Americans have died. Yet America has also emerged with new confidence on the global stage. President Woodrow Wilson travels to Europe to help shape the peace that will follow the war. He hopes to build a new international system that will prevent future conflicts. But the peace negotiations in Paris will prove far more complicated than anyone expects. The First World War may have ended, but the forces that caused it are far from gone. Within the ruins of Europe, new tensions are already beginning to grow, and in just over 20 years, the world will once again descend into an even more devastating war. September 1st, 1939. Dawn breaks over the Polish countryside. Farmers and villagers begin their morning routines as the sun rises slowly over quiet fields. For a moment, the world still feels peaceful. But within minutes that peace is shattered. German warplanes roar across the sky. Bombs fall on roads, bridges, and towns. Columns of armored vehicles surge across the Polish border. The invasion has begun. The man responsible for this attack is Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Germany. For years he has promised to expand German territory and overturn the humiliations imposed after the First World War. Now he is putting those promises into action. German forces move with terrifying speed. Tanks punch through defensive lines while aircraft strike targets far behind the front. This new style of warfare becomes known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Poland's army fights back bravely, but it is overwhelmed by the power and coordination of the German assault. 2 days later, Britain and France deliver an ultimatum demanding that Germany withdraw its forces from Poland. When Hitler refuses, both nations declare war. The Second World War has begun. Yet despite the outbreak of another global conflict, the United States remains determined to stay out of the fighting. Memories of the First World War are still fresh in the minds of many Americans. Thousands of families remember the sons and fathers who never returned from the trenches. Many citizens believe that the war in Europe was a tragedy that America should never have joined. In Washington, the government passes neutrality laws designed to prevent the United States from becoming involved in foreign wars. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understands the dangers posed by aggressive dictatorships, but he also knows that public opinion strongly favors staying out of the conflict. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the war initially unfolds in a strange and uneasy way. After declaring war on Germany, Britain and France launch very few military operations. For several months, the Western Front remains mostly quiet. This period becomes known as the Phony War. But the calm does not last long. In the spring of 1940, Hitler launches a new wave of attacks across Europe. German forces invade Denmark and Norway, securing vital naval bases and access to important resources. Soon afterward, they turn their attention westward toward France and the Low Countries. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg fall quickly under the pressure of the German advance. Then German armored divisions drive through the dense forests of the Ardennes, a region many Allied commanders believed was too difficult for large armies to cross. The strategy works perfectly. German tanks burst through the Allied defenses and race toward the English Channel, cutting off hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers. The trapped Allied forces retreat toward the coastal town of Dunkirk. What follows becomes one of the most dramatic evacuations in military history. Hundreds of naval vessels and civilian boats cross the English Channel to rescue the stranded soldiers. Fishing boats, ferries, and small private ships join the desperate mission. Over the course of several days, more than 300,000 troops are evacuated from the beaches. The rescue saves the core of Britain's army, but it cannot stop the collapse of France. By June 1940, German troops enter Paris. France surrenders shortly afterward. For the first time in modern history, Nazi Germany dominates most of Western Europe. Only Britain remains standing against Hitler from bases in occupied France. German aircraft begin bombing British cities. Night after night, the skies above London and other cities glow with explosions and fire. Civilians take shelter in subway stations while firefighters struggle to control the flames. This air campaign becomes known as the Battle of Britain. Despite intense bombardment, Britain refuses to surrender. Its air force continues fighting fiercely, gradually weakening the German attacks. Across the ocean in the United States, Americans watch these events with growing concern. Although the nation remains officially neutral, many people begin to realize that the outcome of the war could shape the future of the entire world. President Roosevelt searches for ways to support Britain without directly entering the war. One solution becomes known as the Lend-Lease program. Under this policy, the United States sends weapons, supplies, and equipment to countries fighting against Nazi Germany. American factories begin producing enormous quantities of airplanes, tanks, trucks, and ammunition. The United States is slowly becoming the arsenal of democracy. Meanwhile, the conflict continues to expand across the globe. In 1941, Hitler launches his most ambitious operation yet. German armies invade the Soviet Union, opening a massive new front in Eastern Europe. At the same time, tensions are rising in the Pacific Ocean. The Empire of Japan has been expanding its control across Asia for years. Japanese forces occupy large parts of China and seek access to more natural resources in Southeast Asia. The United States opposes this expansion and places economic sanctions on Japan, cutting off vital supplies such as oil and steel. Japanese leaders begin to believe that war with the United States may be unavoidable as negotiations between the two countries stall. Japan secretly prepares a bold and risky plan. They intend to strike a devastating blow against American power in the Pacific. Their target will be the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. For Americans living on the islands, the morning of December 7, 1941 will begin like any other peaceful Sunday. But within hours, the nation will find itself suddenly pulled into the largest war in human history, and the United States will no longer be able to remain on the sidelines. January 1919. Paris, France. Winter winds move through the streets of the French capital as the leaders of the victorious nations gather to decide the future of the world. The First World War has ended, but the scars of the conflict are everywhere. Cities lie in ruins. Millions of families mourn the dead. Entire regions of Europe have been reduced to wastelands of broken buildings and scarred landscapes. Inside the grand halls of Paris, the Allied leaders prepare to negotiate the peace that will shape the decades ahead. Among them stands the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. He arrives with an ambitious vision. Wilson believes the war must end with a fair settlement that prevents future conflicts. He proposes a new international organization where nations can resolve disputes peacefully. His idea becomes known as the League of Nations, but not everyone shares Wilson's idealism. France has suffered enormously during the war. Much of its northern territory has been destroyed by years of fighting. French leaders demand harsh punishment for Germany. They want security guarantees and heavy reparations to rebuild their shattered country. Britain also wants Germany weakened to ensure it can never threaten Europe again. Caught between these competing demands, the negotiations become tense and complicated. Eventually, the Allies produce a document that will become one of the most controversial treaties in modern history, the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty forces Germany to accept full responsibility for the war. It demands enormous financial reparations that the German government must pay to the Allied nations. Large sections of German territory are taken away. The German military is drastically reduced and forbidden from building many types of weapons. For many Germans, the treaty feels like a national humiliation. Meanwhile, Wilson's dream of the League of Nations faces unexpected trouble back home. Although the organization is created as part of the peace agreement, the United States Senate refuses to approve membership. Despite being the nation that proposed the League, the United States never joins it. In the years that follow, America turns inward. After the sacrifices of the war, many Americans believe the country should avoid foreign conflicts altogether. Isolationism becomes a powerful force in American politics. Throughout the 1920s, the United States experiences rapid economic growth. Factories expand. Cities grow. New technologies transform everyday life. Automobiles fill the streets and radios bring news and entertainment into millions of homes. It seems like a new era of prosperity has arrived. But beneath the surface, serious problems are beginning to build. In Germany, the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles create deep resentment. The German economy struggles under the weight of reparations. Inflation spirals out of control during the early 1920s, wiping out the savings of ordinary citizens. Political instability spreads across the country. Radical groups on both the left and the right attempt to seize power. One of these groups is led by a former soldier who fought in the trenches of the First World War. His name is Adolf Hitler. Hitler joins a small political organization called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Through fiery speeches and powerful propaganda, he begins attracting followers who feel betrayed by Germany's defeat and the humiliating treaty. Hitler promises to restore German pride, rebuild the military, and overturn the post-war settlement imposed by the Allies. At first, his movement remains small and fringe. But the world is about to face an economic catastrophe that will change everything. In October 1929, the American stock market crashes dramatically. Investors panic as stock prices collapse. Banks fail and businesses close their doors. Within months, the financial crisis spreads far beyond the United States. The global economy begins to unravel. This disaster becomes known as the Great Depression. Factories shut down across Europe and America. Millions of workers lose their jobs. Families struggle to afford basic necessities like food and shelter. International trade collapses, making the crisis even worse. In times of hardship, people often look for strong leaders who promise quick solutions. Across Europe, extremist political movements gain strength. In Germany, the economic crisis creates the perfect conditions for Hitler's rise to power. His speeches blame Germany's suffering on the Treaty of Versailles, on political enemies within the country, and on minority groups he falsely claims are responsible for the nation's problems. His message spreads rapidly among desperate citizens. In 1933, Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he begins transforming the country into a dictatorship. Political opponents are silenced. Democratic institutions are dismantled. Germany begins secretly rebuilding its military in direct violation of the peace treaty. Across Europe, many leaders hope that Hitler's ambitions can be contained through diplomacy. But Hitler has much larger plans. He believes Germany must expand its territory and dominate the European continent. Meanwhile, in Asia, another power is pursuing its own aggressive expansion. In 1931, the Empire of Japan invades Manchuria, a region of northeastern China rich in natural resources. The League of Nations condemns the invasion but fails to take meaningful action. The weakness of the international system becomes increasingly clear. Aggressive nations are testing the limits of the fragile peace created after the First World War. Back in the United States, many Americans remain focused on recovering from the economic devastation of the Great Depression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduces a series of programs known as the New Deal to rebuild the economy and provide relief to struggling citizens. Roosevelt is also watching the growing tensions overseas with concern. Across Europe, Hitler continues expanding his power. In 1936, German troops march into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized after the First World War. The move violates the Treaty of Versailles, yet no major nation intervenes to stop him. 2 years later, Germany annexes Austria. Soon after, Hitler demands control of parts of Czechoslovakia. Each time he pushes further, hoping that Britain and France will avoid confrontation. For a while, that strategy works, but the fragile peace created in 1919 is slowly collapsing. The world is moving toward another global conflict, and this time, the war will become even more destructive than the one before. For the United States, the question remains uncertain. Will America once again stay out of a European war, or will it be drawn back into the storm of global conflict? The answer will come sooner than anyone expects.
December 7th, 1941. Early morning. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The tropical air is calm as the sun rises over the island of Oahu. Sailors aboard American battleships begin their daily routines. Some are eating breakfast. Others prepare for church services on what seems like an ordinary Sunday. Across the harbor, massive warships sit quietly at anchor. Aircraft rest neatly lined up on nearby airfields. Few people expect any danger. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, however, a fleet of Japanese aircraft carriers move silently through the water. From their decks, hundreds of aircraft prepare for launch. Japan has spent months planning a surprise attack designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. Shortly before 8 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese planes reaches Hawaii. The sound of engines suddenly fills the sky. Moments later, explosions rip across Pearl Harbor. Bombs slam into battleships. Torpedoes tear through the sides of anchored vessels. Smoke and fire rise high above the harbor as sailors scramble for cover. American forces are caught completely by surprise. One of the most devastating moments occurs when a bomb strikes the battleship USS Arizona. The explosion ignites the ship's ammunition stores, creating a massive blast that destroys the vessel and kills more than 1,000 sailors almost instantly. Across the harbor, other ships burn fiercely as crews struggle to fight the flames and rescue trapped comrades. Japanese aircraft also attack nearby airfields, destroying many American planes before they can take off. Within less than 2 hours, the attack is over. The damage is staggering. Several battleships are sunk or heavily damaged. Hundreds of aircraft are destroyed. More than 2,000 American servicemen and civilians are killed, but the Japanese attack has one critical failure. The American aircraft carriers stationed in the Pacific are not at Pearl Harbor that morning. They are at sea and escape destruction. Still, the shock of the attack spreads rapidly across the United States. News bulletins interrupt radio broadcasts as reports arrive from Hawaii. Americans gather around radios in homes, factories, and shops trying to understand what has happened. The nation is stunned. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addresses Congress. His voice is calm but determined as he describes the attack as a date which will live in infamy. Roosevelt asks Congress to declare war on Japan. Within hours, the request is approved almost unanimously. For the second time in the 20th century, the United States has entered a world war. The conflict quickly expands even further. Only days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, believes that American involvement will not change the outcome of the war. Instead, his decision brings the full power of the United States into the global conflict. Across America, millions of citizens respond with determination. Recruitment offices are flooded with volunteers eager to serve their country. Young men join the Army, Navy, and Air Forces in enormous numbers. Training camps fill with new soldiers preparing for battle. At the same time, the United States begins one of the most remarkable industrial mobilizations in history. Factories that once produced automobiles and household appliances shift to wartime production. Assembly lines start building tanks, aircraft, ships, and artillery. Steel mills operate day and night to meet the demand for weapons. Women enter the workforce in huge numbers, taking jobs that had previously been dominated by men. They build aircraft engines, weld ships, and operate heavy machinery in defense plants across the country. The image of the determined factory worker becomes a symbol of the American war effort. Soon the United States is producing weapons and equipment on a scale never seen before. Cargo ships carry supplies across the oceans to support Allied forces fighting in Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, the American military begins planning its strategy for the war. Although Japan attacked first, American leaders believe that defeating Germany must remain the top priority. Nazi Germany controls much of Europe and represents the most powerful enemy. The Allies adopt a strategy known as Germany First, but the Pacific War cannot be ignored. Japanese forces launch rapid attacks across Asia and the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. They capture the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and large parts of Southeast Asia. Island after island falls under Japanese control. American forces in the Pacific face a difficult and dangerous fight to stop the advance. In May 1942, the first major naval battle between the United States and Japan takes place in the Coral Sea. Although both sides suffer losses, the battle stops a Japanese attempt to capture territory near Australia. Only a month later, another decisive battle unfolds near a small island called Midway. American naval commanders prepare an ambush for the Japanese fleet using intelligence information. American aircraft locate and attack Japanese aircraft carriers at a critical moment. Dive bombers strike the ships while their decks are filled with fueled aircraft. Within minutes, several Japanese carriers are engulfed in flames. The Battle of Midway becomes a turning point in the Pacific War. Japan loses for aircraft carriers and many experienced pilots. The balance of naval power in the Pacific begins shifting toward the United States. From this point forward, American forces slowly move from defense to offense across the Pacific Islands. American troops begin launching amphibious assaults against heavily defended Japanese positions. Each island battle will be brutal and costly, but step by step the United States pushes closer toward Japan itself. At the same time, preparations are underway for a massive struggle in Europe. Millions of American soldiers are training for the day they will cross the Atlantic and face Nazi Germany on the battlefields of another continent. The United States is now fully committed to the largest war the world has ever seen, and the coming years will test the nation in ways few people could have imagined.
January 1943. Detroit, Michigan. Inside a massive factory, building, the noise of machinery echoes across the assembly lines. Sparks fly from welding torches while giant metal plates move along conveyor belts. Workers in heavy uniforms guide enormous pieces of steel into place. Only a few years earlier, this factory produced automobiles. Now it builds tanks for war. Across the United States, scenes like this are unfolding everywhere. Shipyards along the coasts construct huge naval vessels. Aircraft factories assemble bombers and fighter planes at incredible speed. Steel mills and ammunition plants operate day and night. The United States has transformed its entire economy for war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt calls the country the arsenal of democracy. American factories are not only supplying the United States military, but also sending weapons and equipment to allied nations fighting against Nazi Germany and Japan. The scale of production is staggering. New cargo ships, known as Liberty ships, are built in record time. Some shipyards manage to construct an entire vessel in just a few weeks. These ships carry tanks, trucks, aircraft parts, food, and fuel across the oceans to support allied armies. In aircraft factories, workers assemble thousands of planes every month. Massive bombers roll off assembly lines while mechanics test engines and install weapons. By the middle of the war, the United States is producing more military equipment than any nation in history. But this industrial miracle requires an enormous workforce. With millions of men serving in the military, factories turn to women to fill the labor shortage. Women learn to operate heavy machinery, weld steel plates, and assemble complex mechanical systems. The image of the determined female factory worker becomes one of the most famous symbols of the war effort. Across the country, families plant victory gardens to help supplement the national food supply. Citizens purchase war bonds to finance military production. Rationing programs limit the use of gasoline, rubber, and other materials needed for the war. The entire nation becomes part of the struggle. Meanwhile, American soldiers are fighting on battlefields across the globe. In North Africa, Allied forces launched their first major campaign against German troops. The German army in this region is commanded by one of its most skilled officers, Erwin Rommel. Known as the Desert Fox, Rommel leads fast-moving armored units through the harsh desert terrain. American forces face him for the first time in early 1943. The initial encounters are difficult. Many American units are inexperienced and struggle against the well-trained German troops. But lessons are learned quickly. With improved coordination, better leadership, and strong support from Allied forces, American soldiers begin pushing the German army back across North Africa. By May 1943, the Axis forces in the region surrender. The victory gives the Allies control of the Mediterranean and opens the door for the next phase of the war. Soon, Allied armies invade the island of Sicily and then move on to the Italian mainland. The campaign through Italy becomes long and difficult as German forces defend mountainous terrain with determination. While fighting continues in Europe, the war in the Pacific grows even more intense. American commanders adopt a strategy known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, Allied forces focus on capturing key positions that can serve as bases for airfields and naval operations. Some islands are heavily defended and require fierce battles to capture point. One of the earliest major fights occurs on the island of Guadalcanal. For months, American Marines and soldiers struggled to hold the island against repeated Japanese attacks. The fighting takes place in dense jungle under extreme heat and constant rain. Eventually, the Japanese are forced to withdraw. The victory marks the first major Allied offensive success against Japan. As the war progresses, American forces continue advancing across the Pacific. Each captured island brings them closer to Japan itself. Naval battles rage across vast stretches of ocean. Aircraft carriers become the dominant force in naval warfare, launching planes that strike enemy ships hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, American submarines begin targeting Japanese shipping routes. These silent vessels attack cargo ships carrying vital supplies such as oil and raw materials. Over time, the submarine campaign severely weakens Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. Back in Europe, the Allied leaders begin planning one of the most ambitious military operations in history. They intend to launch a massive invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The goal is to open a second front in Western Europe that will relieve pressure on the Soviet Union and begin the liberation of the continent from German control. The operation will require an enormous armada of ships, aircraft, and soldiers. Thousands of landing craft are constructed. Millions of tons of supplies are gathered in Britain. Troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations train for the invasion. The operation receives a simple name: Overlord. Its success will depend on surprise, coordination, and overwhelming force. Somewhere along the northern coast of France, Allied soldiers will soon land on heavily defended beaches and attempt to break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. That if the invasion succeeds, it could begin the final chapter of the war in Europe. But if it fails, the conflict might continue. For many more years, the preparations continue through early 1944. Millions of American soldiers wait for the moment when they will finally cross the English Channel. The fate of Europe may soon rest in their hands. June 6, 1944. Early morning. The English Channel. A thick gray sky hangs over a vast armada of ships moving slowly toward the coast of France. The sea is rough and the wind carries the smell of salt and fuel across the decks. Inside crowded landing craft, thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers wait in silence. Many grip their rifles tightly while others stare toward the distant shoreline that is slowly coming into view. Ahead of them lies the heavily fortified coast of Nazi-occupied France. This operation is the largest amphibious invasion in human history. It will soon become known as D-Day. For months, the Allies have prepared for this moment. Under the command of Dwight D. Eisenhower, an enormous force of soldiers, ships, aircraft, and vehicles has gathered in Britain. The goal is simple but incredibly difficult: land on the beaches of Normandy, break through German defenses, and begin the liberation of Western Europe. Before the first soldiers reach the shore, Allied aircraft and warships begin bombarding German positions along the coastline. Explosions shake the cliffs as artillery shells slam into bunkers and defensive walls. High above the battlefield, thousands of paratroopers drop behind enemy lines during the night. Their mission is to capture bridges, disrupt communications, and create confusion among German defenders. As dawn approaches, the landing craft move closer to the beaches. The American forces are assigned two main landing areas known as Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. At Utah Beach, the landing goes relatively smoothly. American troops quickly move inland and begin securing the surrounding countryside. But at Omaha Beach, the situation becomes far more dangerous. German defenses remain largely intact despite the bombardment. Machine gun nests positioned on high cliffs overlook the beach. As the first landing craft arrive, heavy gunfire sweeps across the sand. Many soldiers are struck before they even reach dry land. Those who survive scramble for cover behind obstacles and shallow craters. The noise of battle is overwhelming as bullets strike the water and artillery shells explode nearby. Despite the chaos and heavy losses, small groups of soldiers begin pushing forward. Engineers clear obstacles while infantry units slowly climb the steep cliffs above the beach. Hour by hour, the Americans fight their way inland. By the end of the day, Allied forces have established a fragile foothold in Normandy. The invasion has succeeded. Over the following weeks, more troops, tanks, and supplies pour into France. The Allies begin pushing through the countryside, while German forces attempt to halt their advance. In August 1944, the French capital is finally liberated. Crowds fill the streets of Paris as Allied soldiers enter the city. After years of occupation, the people of France celebrate their freedom, but the war in Europe is far from over. German forces retreat toward their own borders while preparing new defensive positions. As winter approaches, Hitler launches a desperate counterattack in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. This battle becomes known as Battle of the Bulge. German armored divisions smash into the Allied lines, creating a large bulge in the front. The sudden assault catches many Allied units by surprise. American soldiers face freezing temperatures, deep snow, and intense fighting as they attempt to stop the German advance point. One of the most famous moments occurs in the town of Bastogne, where surrounded American troops refuse to surrender despite being cut off by German forces. Eventually, the Allied armies regroup and launch powerful counterattacks. By early 1945, the German offensive collapses. From that point forward, Nazi Germany is on the defensive everywhere. Allied forces push eastward across the Rhine River into the heart of Germany. At the same time, the Soviet army advances from the east after years of brutal fighting against German forces. Cities across Germany suffer heavy bombing and artillery fire as the Allied armies close in. By April 1945, the end of the war in Europe is near. Deep inside a bunker beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler realizes that defeat is inevitable. With enemy armies surrounding the city, his regime begins to collapse. Soon afterward, Germany formally surrenders to the Allied powers. Across Europe, people celebrate the end of the war. For the United States and its allies, the defeat of Nazi Germany marks a historic victory. The brutal dictatorship that once dominated much of the continent has finally been destroyed. But even as celebrations spread through Europe, another war continues to rage on the other side of the world. In the Pacific Ocean, American forces are still fighting their way toward Japan, and the final stage of the conflict will bring some of the most devastating weapons ever created. The Second World War is not over yet. February 1945. Iwo Jima, Pacific Ocean. Dark volcanic sand stretches across the beaches of a small island halfway between Japan and the Mariana Islands. From the sea, hundreds of American ships surround the island while aircraft roar overhead. Inside their fortified tunnels and bunkers, thousands of Japanese soldiers prepare for battle. The island may be small, but its location makes it extremely important. American commanders want to capture Iwo Jima so that damaged bombers returning from missions over Japan can land safely. It will also provide a base for fighter aircraft escorting bombing raids that on the morning of the invasion, American Marines moved toward the shore in waves of landing craft. As soon as the first troops step onto the black sand, intense gunfire erupts from hidden Japanese positions. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery strike the beach as soldiers struggle to move forward across the soft volcanic terrain. The battle quickly becomes one of the most brutal fights of the Pacific War. Japanese forces defend the island from an enormous network of tunnels carved deep into the rock. Even after heavy bombardment from ships and aircraft, many of these positions remain intact. American Marines are forced to clear them one by one. Flamethrowers, grenades, and close-range combat become necessary to remove the defenders hidden inside caves and bunkers. After weeks of relentless fighting, the United States finally captures the island. During the battle, a small group of Marines raises the American flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi. A photograph of that moment becomes one of the most famous images of the entire war, but the victory comes at a terrible cost. Thousands of American soldiers are killed or wounded, and nearly all of the Japanese defenders die in the battle. Despite the losses, the Allied advance toward Japan continues. Only 2 months later, another fierce battle begins on the island of Okinawa. Okinawa lies much closer to the Japanese mainland and becomes the final stepping stone before a possible invasion of Japan itself. The fighting lasts nearly 3 months. Japanese forces launch desperate counterattacks while kamikaze pilots crash explosive-filled aircraft into Allied ships. Entire villages are destroyed as the battle spreads across the island. By the time Okinawa is secured, the scale of the destruction shocks American military planners. They begin to realize that invading the Japanese mainland could lead to millions of casualties on both sides. At the same time, the United States has been secretly developing a powerful new weapon. For years, scientists working on the Manhattan Project have been researching nuclear technology capable of producing an explosion far more destructive than any conventional bomb. In July 1945, the first successful test of this weapon takes place in the desert of New Mexico. Soon afterward, the new American president, Harry S. Truman, must decide how the weapon will be used. With Japan refusing to surrender and an invasion looming, Truman authorizes the use of atomic bombs against Japanese cities. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber drops the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion destroys much of the city within seconds. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. The devastation is unlike anything the world has ever witnessed. Faced with the threat of further destruction, Japan finally announces its surrender on September 2, 1945. Representatives of Japan formally signed the surrender documents aboard the battleship USS Missouri. The Second World War has ended. Across the globe, people celebrate the return of peace. Soldiers begin the long journey home. Cities slowly rebuild after years of destruction. For the United States, the war has transformed the nation. Millions of Americans served in the military, and the country's industrial power proved essential to the Allied victory. The United States now emerges from the conflict as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. Another superpower also rises from the war, the Soviet Union. The uneasy alliance between these two nations soon begins to break down. Differences in ideology and political systems create deep mistrust between the former allies. Within only a few years, the world will enter a new era of tension known as the Cold War. But the legacy of the Second World War will continue shaping global politics, technology, and international cooperation for decades. New organizations such as the United Nations are created in hopes of preventing another global conflict. The memory of the two world wars serves as a reminder of how destructive modern warfare can become when diplomacy fails and aggression goes unchecked. From the trenches of the First World War to the atomic explosions that ended the Second, the first half of the 20th century reshaped the entire world. And through those turbulent decades, the United States moved from a cautious nation watching events from afar to a central power shaping the future of the modern world. The story of the world wars is not only a story of battles and leaders. It is a story of ordinary people who endured unimaginable hardship, who fought for survival, and who struggled to build a more stable world from the ashes of global conflict. Their sacrifices changed history forever. 1945. Across the globe, the guns have fallen silent, but the world is not at peace. Cities lie in ruins, entire populations displaced, economies shattered. Europe is littered with debris and skeletons of once thriving towns. In Asia, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are burned landscapes of fire and ash. For the United States, the war has been costly. Over 400,000 Americans have died, millions more wounded. Families across the nation mourn lost sons, daughters, and spouses. The soldiers who return home carry scars, both visible and invisible, but the impact goes far beyond the battlefield. Women who joined the workforce during the war discovered independence and skills that would transform society. African Americans and other minority groups who served in the military demand recognition and equal rights at home. The social changes set in motion by wartime mobilization ripple through post-war America at the same time. The United States faces a responsibility unlike any before. It is now a global superpower. Its economy dominates the world. Its military and industrial strength can project power across oceans. The world turns to America for leadership in rebuilding nations, creating peacekeeping institutions, and preventing future global conflicts. Out of the ashes of war, organizations such as the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund take shape, aiming to stabilize nations and foster cooperation. The human cost is staggering, but Americans recognize the stakes. The sacrifices made by millions ensured the survival of democratic nations and checked the spread of totalitarian regimes. The lessons of war, both its devastation and the need for preparedness, become a guiding principle for future generations, 1946 and beyond. Across the globe, nations begin rebuilding. Europe is scarred but resilient. Japan rises slowly from the ashes of atomic destruction. Former battlefields are cleared. Cities are reconstructed. The lives of millions begin again under new circumstances. For America, the post-war era marks the start of unprecedented influence in world affairs. The Marshall Plan sends billions in aid to rebuild Europe. The United States helps establish international agreements to promote peace and economic stability. Its military presence ensures security in regions threatened by the remnants of war. Yet the world also changes in unexpected ways. The Cold War emerges, dividing nations and shaping global politics for decades. Nuclear weapons become central to international strategy, a constant reminder of the destructive potential humanity now wields. American veterans return home, eager to resume civilian life. Education and housing programs help integrate them into post-war society. Communities remember the fallen, while museums and memorials preserve the memory of the wars for future generations. The legacy of the world wars is immense. Technology, medicine, and industry advanced rapidly due to wartime necessity. Social changes accelerate. Nations recognize the need for diplomacy and international cooperation, even as new conflicts arise. The story of America in the world wars is not only a tale of battles, strategy, and leaders. It is a story of courage, resilience, and transformation. Ordinary people endured extraordinary hardships, yet they contributed to shaping the modern world. From the trenches of France to the islands of the Pacific, from the factories of Detroit to the halls of Washington, the United States emerged as a nation that could no longer remain isolated. It became a decisive force in a rapidly changing global order. The wars are over, but their lessons endure. They remind us of the fragility of peace, the cost of aggression, and the power of unity in the face of global challenges. The world that emerged from the fires of the 20th century is still defined by these events. And the story of America's perspective on the world wars remains a testament to human endurance, innovation, and the desire to protect freedom.